education work group meeting. It has really been a journey that we've gone through. It's quite fruitful. I'm opening tonight because on behalf of Dr. Wright and Dr. Smith, they are in Annapolis. They've been testifying and in hearings um, and again, I'll say the same thing I said to Ms. Zabi for those who weren't here. They're out there fighting the good fight for our students and children across Maryland. As we go through today, you understand we do. I've already shared. Please read the confidentiality statement. Can you go to the next slide, please? So tonight's conversation is a great one. But before we get into it, sorry for the person clicking. Go ahead. Please just ensure that your name appears correctly, and there's the directions there for you. We'll pause for a moment if you don't know them so you can see the directions for getting your name in there correctly. I think we can move on. I think we mastered that in 16 workshops, work groups. There's a note to attendees. This meeting is being recorded and is live streamed via MSDE's YouTube channel. If you need this in Spanish, there are your directions. There's also a button for closed captioning if you need that. And we're also thankful for our ASL interpreter. For those who need that when we go into small groups, please remain in group 1. That's where that service will be. And remember that those who are in small group 1, that's also the group that'll be live streamed. Next slide, please. So briefly, we'll be going over just have some welcome and introductions. There is no public comment tonight. We'll be reviewing the December feedback and the recommendations. Hopefully you've had a chance to read your pre-reading. You've had a chance to read the recommendations. You're ready to either ask questions or approve so that we can move forward. Tonight's conversation will be on behavior and discipline, more focusing on things that we can do and the adults can do and the teachers can do rather than what students are doing to help them. So we want to reduce exclusionary practices. We'll go into our breakout groups. We'll have our large group discussion. And then during the wrap up and closing, I'm going to share what our current status is and what we can look for over the next over the next few months, leading all the way to 2026. And with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Zogby.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I cannot believe that we are here 18 months later, 16 meetings. I just want to say briefly, thank you to each one of you for participating in this effort, for bringing your expertise and sharing your perspectives. I think we should be really proud of what we've accomplished together and the journey we've been on and all the things that we've covered. It really is a pretty extraordinary achievement. And I want to also just say thank you to MSDE leadership and staff, particularly in the Division of Early Intervention and Special Education Services, for the incredible work that they've done supporting the work group. And it's been a lot, and they've risen to the challenge over and over. So a lot of appreciation for them. As I think about it, it seems incredible to me that we have arrived at so much consensus, not only on what the problems are, what the barriers are, but on so many of the solutions, despite all the different perspectives. I think we have really painted a picture for what it would look like to improve education and outcomes for students with disabilities. We know what to do, and now it's time to start doing it. Amongst the many recommendations that are tasks and prioritized, that will build into our prioritized implementation plan, there's also that shift in mindset and what we've talked about throughout this, that sort of foundational piece that we all agree that students with disabilities can achieve great things, and they are capable of achieving grade level standards, and it's our job to provide them with the services and supports so that they can do that. So one note about behavior, and I love the way that Dr. Hickman kind of framed it. It is around what adults can do, and in that, thinking about keeping keeping students centered in the discussion and in our behavior, something that's come up obviously in almost every one of our meetings together. And we've talked about it as it affects teacher retention. We've talked about it from a data perspective. I just want to say one thing about sort of thinking about students and how behavior is communication and all that it can communicate, not in a doing a functional behavior assessment kind of way, but in a bigger way, right? That student behavior communicates what's happening for a student, and it might be about something, about trauma. It might reflect the trauma of a community. It might be about mental health. It might be about the pandemic and what a child has gone through. And I think sometimes we think as adults, the period of the pandemic for us was a small percentage of our lives, and we may have moved on. But for children, that few years represented a large percentage of their lives. And it's that once in a generation kind of trauma that they have not moved on from. And we don't have any student behavior might also be a communication about whether students are getting the right support, the right services, and what their response to instruction is. And then also around social needs, and do they feel connected and that they belong in their communities. Last sort of bit of framing about behavior is just, from my perspective, kids want to do well. They want to succeed. They want to learn at school. They want to be part of their school community and feel that they belong. And when they don't, they end up on a road that leads to exclusionary discipline or school avoidance or work refusal, or any of the things that we see overrepresented for students with disabilities. It's our job as the adults to establish the systems and supports that will support them in their growth and development, and get out of the mindset of that we're going to force them to comply, or that we're going to fix what's broken rather than support kids in their development. So really glad that we're going to have this discussion today, and we can get on with it. So we can move on to, we have no public comment. We can go to the feedback from our December meeting, which was on students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. So just a few highlights from that feed, from those exit tickets and small group discussions. We asked about what statewide policies and guidance MSDE could implement to ensure that only students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are being determined eligible for participation in the alternate assessment. Oh, Buzzy, did you have something?
If you'll forgive me, I did want to say just a couple of introductory things.
Sure, go ahead.
One, I hearken back to when you and Leslie and I and maybe others put pressure on AIB to create this work group. At the time, the department wasn't interested. There's a new ball game, obviously, with Dr. Wright. And I do not believe anything like we're working on has ever been done anywhere in the country. Nothing close. At the same time, we have a responsibility to understand the prioritization process. It's going to take a long, and I appreciate that we'll be looking to ensure that there is reasonable follow through, but it's a tough job, and I couldn't admire the department more for making this commitment. Thank you.
Thanks, Buzzy. I concur. All right. So sorry, let's go back to the feedback for exit tickets on most significant cognitive disabilities. So we asked about eligibility, how we make sure we're determining the right students eligible. People talked about prohibiting young children from being found eligible, focusing on communicative competence and access to assistive technology and speech and language services, making sure that the eligibility criteria were clear and that folks are trained in using them. And that there's accessible resources for families, including families that do not speak English, so that they can make informed decisions. And we talked about, some folks talked about training and guidance on instructing students with moderate cognitive disabilities who might be on the sort of the cusp of eligibility to make sure that they don't end up inappropriately identified. We asked about instruction aligned to the state's challenging academic content standards, making sure that that is happening, policies and practices and procedures. People talked about training, including things like direct coaching and wraparound support for schools, for general and special educators and administrators on what standards aligned instruction looks like for these students. There was some feedback about the importance of collaborative planning time, which is timely in this moment. There was discussion around developing and sharing model and state recommended curricula and accessible instructional materials and best practice for instruction. And a lot of people brought up the work that the TIES Center had done in their materials that are here in Maryland. There was a question around how we make sure that we are not precluding students from attempting to complete the requirements for a high school diploma, that element of the law. A lot of the response to that was about guidance, but also just explaining to people what it looks like first. What does it even mean for a student who's eligible for alternate assessments to pursue a diploma? And that is not well understood. Equity and access to credit-bearing courses into CTE. There's a question specifically about young children being identified. Again, people said prohibit children from being found eligible until they're at assessment level age. Inclusive practices, things like that. There was a question about evidence-based practices to improve the experiences and long-term outcomes of these students. People talked about UDL, inclusive practices, training for educators, a lot of stuff we've put into previous recommendations. And then finally, there was a question about how do we ensure that the policies and initiatives of the blueprint include consideration of this group of students. People talked about reviewing all the forms, guidance, blueprint programs to ensure that they actually include all students. People talked about micro-credentialing and CTE, equitable resource allocation, and training for administrators and educators on how blueprint initiatives apply to these students. And people talked about bias. And then there were just a couple of interesting comments that people made in kind of that last question on the exit ticket, which is about like other things you're thinking about or other questions you have. People talked about really thinking about long-term outcomes for this particular group of students, active partnership with families. And someone said, we need to break the cycle of how and why we do things. We have a lot of baggage to unpack about our beliefs and expectations. Oftentimes, we are the actual barrier to a student meeting their potential, which I just thought was interesting. So that brings us to the recommendation for this topic. So there are two. The first one is MSDE should develop a plan within 60 days with specific tasks and timelines to ensure that only students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are being determined eligible for participation in the alternate assessments. The plan should include development of a standard preventing eligibility determinations of students before the IEP that will be in effect during their first year of required state assessment, clearer eligibility criteria and more explicit guidance and training on the eligibility tool, including accessible information for families, improved implementation and enhanced monitoring of existing guidance on access to assistive technology and speech and language services, particularly for young children, and development of guidance and professional learning related to instruction for students with moderate cognitive disabilities who are on the cusp of eligibility and may not qualify because of adaptive and social skills. So let's stop there and see if anyone has a thought or question on that.
Liz,
Okay.
this is
Yep.
David Stone.
Yep, you do.
Hi, good afternoon. For this particular one, these are good recommendations, but I think that it would we should really strengthen our recommendation related to allowing students to take more of a hybrid type of program, especially as they approach the middle grades, so that parents have time to develop strategies and have time to really review data. I know that a lot of folks are anxious to select a pathway for these students by middle school, but folks that I work with feel that could even be delayed further. And there are many opportunities for kids who you describe on the cusp to take some of the academic classes as well as some of the more functional classes that would give them the skills for independence later on. So if I think, as you mentioned earlier, people pigeonhole too quickly, and there's opportunities for kids to take classes that they may be stronger in.
I love that suggestion. I wonder whether, I think that might maybe more appropriately fit in the second one. Since this one is supposed to be sort of focused on the eligibility question, and the second one will be on improving the educational experiences and long-term outcomes for these students.
Well, I guess what I would say for eligibility would be to delay.
Yeah. So that first, the first bullet point there is the one on, and I will say the feedback was pretty strong from a lot of people, that the state should prohibit students being identified prior to third grade. And I guess I agree. That is my position. And I don't mind the recommendation itself being stronger in that sense. The one caveat I guess I would give is the state is then going to have to, I mean, that would be I don't know, that would be our recommendation, I think. Do you have something to say about that, Dr. Hickman?
No, I think that when we were, compiling and looking through, we understand that the recommendation is strong. We understand the position of the special education work group on this particular one, but I want to assure you that, as written, when we're looking at the first one, development of a standard preventing eligibility determination of students before those things are going to be calculated. We have to do our research. We've got to make sure that we look at what other states do. What does the law say? Can we do it? And then how will we go about making that change? So it's more into it than it appears here, but that's the reason and rationale behind it. But the special education work group is making some pretty strong recommendations. Some things that like was just shared. Did we lose him? But we can consider that.
I mean, David, do you have a sense of what you would like it to say?
No, not until I see the second slide.
Okay.
I probably
All right.
jumped the gun anyway, so
Okay.
thanks.
Can I say something? This is Bess Cropper from Worcester.
Sure.
Coming from a school system too, I feel strongly like David does. I think that it needs to be pushed higher. I think third grade that third grade IEP is too young.
Mhm.
I think that preventing eligibility, I think we need to push it further, in my opinion. It needs to be past elementary, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Bess, do you think that that would be the case? This is going to take us a little far afield, but do you think that that would be the case even if, from my perspective, if the assessment was just the assessment and the instruction was separate and the placement was separate, I would be less concerned about what assessment students were taking, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that's a loaded question. So absolutely, if you separate instruction, so we know that placement is separate anyway. That's two separate decisions. A lot of parents don't understand that, and that's where your guidance and your profession and your training for parents is going to come in. That's what's going to be great. But I think that kids haven't even reached puberty yet. And we're making a decision, a lifelong decision, when a child's 8 years old. And I think that we really, as a group, need to think about the impact of that for these kiddos.
Mhm.
Because, and you think about trend data, you want 3 points of data, correct? For trend data. And a reeval is done every 3 years. So just, I want to throw that out there too. So you kind of want to think, I think 8 is too young.
Mhm.
And then you run into the fact, if you do leave it at that 8, I'm saying 8 because of 3rd grade, the first year of the required state assessment. If you leave it there, then you're always going to have kids there. You're always going to have kids there, and you're always going to have people pushing the limit and parents pushing it as well, not just schools, but parents are going to advocate for that too. So just a thought.
Go ahead, Dee.
Something that our group spoke about the last time with respect to this was perhaps having some sort of parent training so that they can, by the time they get to the stage where this conversation needs to happen, they can provide informed consent, because that was an issue that was happening before. By age 8 years old, parents weren't tapped in enough to either community resources or resources at the school level so that they could actually make an informed decision about how to proceed with their child, what their rights are with a parent and as a parent, and what their options are. If this education with the parent starts sooner, say pre-K or kindergarten, I think a different trajectory may possibly happen by age 8. So something that we proposed or came up with in our group was maybe some mandatory training that parents would have to have before signing off. So proof that they have gone through whatever this training is. And we recommended something through Parents Place, like I think I did the parent leaders training when my child was in high school. Granted, it was much later, but they have all kinds of baby training, or something. So just a community resource. You're welcome, Renee. There are all kinds of community resources that are shared across the state where that standard could be standardized across the state. So I'm just adding that piece from our last conversation. Thank you.
Zach, would you say that in that 4th bullet, I mean, even though it doesn't say parents, but when we're talking about guidance, professional learning related to this, I mean, of course we can say and for parents, but would you say that is where we captured that?
I think maybe we captured it in the 2nd bullet, which
Okay.
is making sure that the eligibility criteria are clear and that there's more explicit guidance and training on the eligibility tool. But
Okay.
actually, I think what Dee's talking about is maybe even more expansive than that, because she's not just talking about the process of eligibility, but also all the implications of sort of the different paths that students end up on, and what instruction should look like and things like that. Diane, did you have something?
I did. Thank you. I kind of want to echo what Beth said about potentially like separating those decisions, because I think in Anne Arundel, we do a good job of really going through the process now and explaining it. And I'll be the first to admit, yes, there is an over referral, over identification rate by some of our schools. But I think what's happening is at times we are getting IEPs from other jurisdictions within state, out of state, where it's written into the IEP that they are participating and utilizing the unique learning system as a curriculum. However, they have not identified them as being eligible to participate in the alternate framework. And so I think for many parents that can become disingenuous, right? You're providing this to your child without really knowing the consequences of only being exposed to the unique learning system. And so I think for some systems, when we get these kids and parents want X, we can't really do that because we are really not utilizing that curriculum unless they are truly eligible.
So, what I'm hearing, I feel like, is a lot of the nuance that was in the feedback that maybe people don't feel is sufficiently included in the words of the recommendations. And I don't want that to be the case. So, but I
Maybe, well,
Mhm.
maybe in this instance, let's go to 2
Okay,
and then see if it's in 2.
okay,
Link up, okay, and then
okay.
maybe just come back to 1
All right,
and
sounds
do 'em
good.
both.
All right, so number 2 is, again, plan for a plan, to improve the educational experiences and long-term outcomes of students with the most significant cognitive disabilities by aligning their instruction with the state's challenging content standards and not precluding students from attempting to complete their requirements for a high school diploma. The plan should address development of guidance and professional learning, including direct coaching for general and special educators and administrators on what standards aligned instruction looks like for these students and what it means to not preclude students from attempting to complete the requirements for a high school diploma. Dissemination of model state recommended curricula and accessible instructional materials and best practices for instruction, for example, the TIES resources. Development of a standard limiting identification of students prior to high school as pursuing a certificate of program completion, development of a standard prohibiting alternate assessment classrooms, development of statewide standards and guidance that prioritizes communicative competence for students with significant cognitive disabilities and focuses on access to assistive technology, ensure access to credit-bearing courses and CTE programs, and safeguarding collaborative planning time. So maybe actually, yeah, some of the pieces we've just been talking about are actually in this part of it.
For me, that captures what I was thinking.
Okay.
But I would like to add another thing while we're on this page.
Sure.
We don't really talk a lot about options for post-school and how we might better utilize the time in school to link towards after graduation activities. So, for example, like we have a program, not to plug us, but we have a program that works with kids from 18 to 20, 18 and above that is very much linked with the work that we do at the school as well, and allows kids to have some options right away and services continue after they graduate. So something about that would be great.
Mm-hmm. And okay, I'm wondering about whether I'm not remembering exactly what was in our piece on secondary transition.
Oh,
But I wonder whether that was captured in that piece.
Yeah, I did not look back at that. You're right.
So I would think that that would be captured in the recommendations around transition. I think that some of the other things that are underway as well, separate from the blueprint, around the endorsements, and so forth, all of which are working to ensure that students, even if they're not exiting with a high school diploma, are exiting college, career, community ready based on their choices and post-school goals, and using that time from 18 to 21. So I think that there's significant and exciting work being done. It's just not it's not part of the blueprint because it's already moving forward. And so and I appreciate the leadership of MSDE with trying to make that certificate process, in particular, more meaningful and better aligned with the post-school outcomes under the philosophy of the blueprint that all should be exiting school, college, and or career ready.
I'm going to make a recommendation.
Go ahead.
Unless if someone has some specific language that they would like to consider adding to either the first recommendation or the second recommendation, that's fine. But I want to remind you, as I was going to share at the end of the presentation, we currently have about 25 recommendations. This will be 26, I think. And within each recommendation, there's like 4 or 5 pieces. So we're going to have about 120 some actions to do. So you will have an opportunity. It doesn't have to go into this recommendation, but when we prioritize any language that's missing or anything that we may be missing, when we look at all of them together and try to, narrow them down to immediate, near, future, then you'll get a chance to come out then, rather than try to wordsmith it here, or we pause. What are your thoughts? Is there some specific language that between recommendation 1 and 2 that you would want to add, or can we go towards accepting these 2 recommendations and add language later?
The only thing I think maybe we should add is in the first bullet point in this number 2, I think we could add something that says development of guidance and professional learning for general and special educators and administrators, and parent training on what standards align, because I think that gets at what a missing piece, which is parents need to understand what the implications of these questions are, and how and they don't understand the idea of how could my child take the alternate assessment but still be in general education classrooms. That doesn't compute for a lot of people. So if everybody's amenable to that, I'd like to insert and parent training as well into that one.
If there are any objections,
Okay, great.
raise your digital hand. Okay.
I'm
All
sorry,
right.
Liz, can you go back to that first recommendation for me? I'm sorry. I won't take much time.
Nope, somebody who's got the technical prowess will do that. Bud,
Brian.
oh, that's you, Doug Rickman. Very good.
That was Brian, not at
So-
all me.
The only thing that I would, because I know that I'm not going to get this, but I want to say again that I think that the first year before that state assessment is too early. But could we at least let them participate in the state assessment for the first time and do it the second year? I mean, we're making a decision before they even participate in the first gen ed assessment. So just throwing that out there. And children with autism, I don't know. I don't know.
Let's give me a little bit more.
Just throwing it out there. But I can live with it. I can't live with it, but I will live with it.
I mean, that first bullet could be reworked to say something more like development of a standard preventing early eligibility determinations of students. Somehow to communicate that the very earliest, this is not to say let's capture everybody in the 3rd grade, right? What it should be saying is the earliest determinations should be made during the first year of students being required to take assessments, but many other children will not be identified then. They will be identified much, much later than that. I don't know how to kind of capture that. I think that's the spirit of what people were communicating. And I think that the department has heard that that's the spirit of what the recommendation is around. Does that make sense? Go ahead, Molly.
I love all of these conversations so much. And I just want to say how much I appreciate everyone's advocacy. I think one thing is what we would do if this was only a Dr. Hickman, Molly, Brian, Carmen, Allison, Gary decision versus what we're permitted as a state to do. And Liz, I know you're helping us out there with research too. So I just want to name a shared spirit and a shared concern about students being identified so young. That's definitely a shared concern. It's just an area that we have to research and see what is it we are permitted to do.
And I think that's why when we were trying to wordsmith to even get to this point, it was, we understand what the passion, drive, determination is, but really, in order to develop the standard, we're going to do research, what the state's doing, what are we allowed to do, what are others doing, and who's found a way around it. And then it's work to get to the point of not identifying children so early and not predetermining and not stepping into all those other landmines. But we agree. We don't want to, we want them to not to be identified so early. Now, is there some language that we want to, well, How about this? I think we can agree to the two recommendations, but we need to do something to that first bullet to strengthen it, right? And
Yeah.
and Liz, and I'm putting it on to you. My wordsmithers, Liz and Molly will come up with something.
Yep.
Probably before we get off this call at 6, but I don't know.
And Dr. Badawi put something in the chat saying using the word earliest, and I think that's right. I think there's a way to communicate that not only would we prevent them prior to that, but that those would be the very earliest, and it would not be all, there would be an opening for third grade, but it would not be, there'd be many students who would not be determined eligible at that point. So I think that's, let's go ahead and approve these two recommendations and move forward. We are going to have a process, and we're going to talk about it at the end, because there's going to probably be recommendations that come out of our discussion tonight, and we're not going to come back together for a whole group meeting. So there'll have to be some kind of, we'll do that via email or some other kind of approval process. So at that time, we will come up with something a little bit different for this first bullet point and circulate it for folks to take a look at. Does that sound good as a process? Bess, will that work for you? Okay, great. All right.
Great job.
Thanks, everyone. All right. And
All right.
on to Nate. Dr.
On to
Levin.
Nate Davison. Thank you. Are you there, sir? Provide us with behavior and discipline.
Great. Very excited to begin our conversation around behavior and discipline, especially the focus on how to reduce exclusionary behavior and discipline practices. What I wanted to do is take 10 minutes or so, share a bit of a national perspective. I've been working with school systems across 30 states, and this discussion of behavior and discipline comes up in every conversation. It almost does not matter what the topic that started the conversation is. It is part of virtually every conversation, and just wanted to share a little bit of that perspective. Don't want to spend too much time on why this is important, because I think every single person on this call knows why it's important, and really wanted to just share what are some of the emerging trends, both good and not so good, that we're seeing out there, just to give us a little more context as we get into our small and large groups to talk about what can MSDE do to make things better, but wanted to try to lay some of the national context for folks. So that's the goal. Whoever's running that, yep. So the guiding question is, what statewide policies, practices, and supports should MSDE establish and provide to prevent exclusionary discipline and strengthen the development of students' lagging skills and coping skills to minimize concerning behaviors? So again, as Liz and others have mentioned, the focus of our discussion is on one, what is the role of, what can MSDE do to help? And it is really what can the districts and the adults do to help the students. And that is where we want to keep our conversation. Next slide. I think an important part of the context is the rise of challenging behaviors. We're seeing a couple things from the field. And again, this is true in virtually every state, every district, spans almost every community demographics. One is teachers and principals sharing that challenging behavior is just leading to a lot of lost instruction. This one survey said virtually 24 hours of instruction, 2.4 hours of instruction each week. That's 3 weeks of instruction that teachers are feeling that they are losing due to challenging behavior. And we're also seeing that about 80% of folks in the schools reporting that the impact of COVID, and I think it's listed, it is clear and present every day. We are not, in a post-COVID world. It is very real for a lot of kids, and teachers are feeling it. So it is very front of mind in virtually every school system. Next slide. And what we're seeing, as you know, certainly here in Maryland, is a lot of exclusionary discipline. And I think, you know, you're seeing roughly 1 in 10 students with a disability experiencing exclusionary discipline. That is an extraordinarily high number. It is kids without, if you look at all students, it's about half that, which is still an extraordinarily high number, but for kids with disabilities, twice the rate. And certainly the trend is not moving in a direction we would want to see it move. Next slide. Want to make sure folks are clear on some of the language that I'm using today and we used in the pre-reading. Exclusionary discipline includes practices that remove students from the general education classrooms, transfer them out of their home schools, or exclude them from school altogether. And this includes the so-called informal removals. We are definitely seeing this idea that a trend, and not a positive one to be sure, but a trend that says, hey, one way to deal with students who have challenging behaviors is to remove them. And if you're being removed, you're not learning. You're not in class to learn. You're not even necessarily in the school to your home school. And as and I suspect a lot of folks in this group would look at this and say, whoa, you know, exclusionary discipline, it is the worst of all solutions. I just want to put out there that one of the trends we are seeing, and again, I don't want to say this is true in every school or in every district in Maryland, but one of the trends we are definitely seeing across this country is growing support for exclusionary discipline. So I just want to do that bit of grounding, that we look at this, and I think this is different from virtually every other discussion we have had as a working group when we've said, hey, you know, kids aren't getting access to core instruction, or kids need high quality teachers, or almost all of the best practices, almost all of the recommendations that I think the working group has made. I think the vast majority of educators would say, yeah, we want that too. We don't know how to do it, or we don't have the people to do it, or we don't have the money to do it, but they want to do it. I just want to put out there that I don't think it is fair to say that we have the same level of support from the field for ending exclusionary discipline. One story I want to tell is really frightening, is at a conference in Louisiana. It's a teachers and educators conference. About 6,000 teachers and administrators were there. These are people who care a lot, because this was after school was over. They are coming. They're not being paid to be there. There was a committee called the Let Teachers Teach Committee, which was composed of, I think it was about 20 former Teacher of the Years. So these are people who've been selected by their administrators, by their peers as really good teachers. They met and came up with a framework of recommendations, and, you know, saying it bluntly, and they said it nicer than this, but stripping away, what they said was, we want more exclusionary discipline. And when they said that, they got a standing ovation. I did not stand, but it was really unsettling to see how popular this idea was by people who really care about kids. So I just wanted to set that first bit of framework, or that bit of context, that the tide is moving in the opposite direction of wanting to end exclusionary discipline. Next slide. Certainly a place where everybody agrees from I think most of us plus out in the field, is the need for more support, more mental health staff, more mental health support, the need for professional training. People want to, nobody is thinking that, hey, we've got this figured out, or that the current services are meeting the needs. But I do think that there is still this trend towards a reasonable approach to this challenge. is to streamline or improve exclusionary discipline. Next slide. Certainly the state and the laws provide some protections. The manifestation determination, which I won't get into all the details, certainly it is a way of protecting students with disabilities, but the manifestation determination has been around for a long time, and we still have 1 in 10 kids with disabilities experiencing exclusionary discipline. And certainly there's laws that require a great deal of data collection, so we know how challenging the problem is, except we don't fully know how challenging the problem is because some of these informal, unreportable events are kind of a backdoor towards probably even more exclusionary discipline than we're able to capture through data reporting. But a lot of data is collected, but the data tells a challenging story for sure. Next slide. Here's where we get to, I think the good news to this story that, the first few slides, not super great news, that there is a lot of research about best practice approaches that can dramatically reduce challenging behaviors. If you could click through the next couple bullet points. The research does tell us that a multifaceted approach, this idea of focusing on prevention, and by focusing on prevention, we mean helping stop challenging behavior before it happens. That if somebody's not muted, if you could mute.
So where would grandma and grandpa go to sleep?
If I can. Thank you. This idea of focusing on prevention, teaching kids the skills they need to cope and prevent. It also means teaching skills to teachers and administrators. It's also providing adult support. But I think the one key takeaway is there really is research and real life schools that have done a much better job so that exclusionary discipline isn't required to eliminate that lost learning time, lost teaching time. And so much of it does focus on helping students, not punishing students. It is helping them by creating environments that prevent the triggers. It is helping teachers understand that they are unintentionally at times triggering students. And again, as we've said, building the skills in students so they have greater ability to not be disruptive, because kids don't want to be disruptive. They just currently don't know how to not be. Next slide. I think that so I think the other big piece, if there is good news that research says we know what works, in school systems across the country, this has been a really, really hard thing to implement. Certainly there's a mindset issue that is, I have said with like excitement that there are these best practices that really, really work. As I and others have shared them across the country, you sometimes see an audience of administrators and teachers thinking, whoa, this is really soft, this is consequence-free. People are not automatically loving these best practices from a philosophical point of view. We've seen in a lot of school systems as they try to implement these best practices, it is adding more work to classroom teachers who feel already overwhelmed. And so we're not necessarily seeing some of these best practices widely supported by teachers. Again, some definitely do, and some have definitely embraced this, but not as many as we would probably like to see. We've seen school systems really struggle to manage what is a really complicated system. A really complicated set of mental health, behavior, setting context, training teachers, training kids, providing skills. It's complicated, and we have seen school districts struggle to manage all that complexity. And lastly, and perhaps very foundationally, I have said repeatedly in the last 10 minutes that there's these best practices out there. There are not a lot of people who are trained in these best practices. I have been in school systems that have 40,000 students, and we can count about 4 people who have formal or even informal training in these best practices. So they are well established. They've been around for 20 plus years, but they are not widely known and they're not widely available. The knowledge is not widely available in many school systems. So that's just a little bit on the context. I'm done talking. Really want to get your insights as people think about what can MSDE do to help, but wanted to acknowledge both some of kind of the mood in the field and some of the challenges systems have seen as they've tried to implement the best practices. Next slide. We're ready for breakout groups. I think after 16 sessions, people have a pretty good sense of how this all works. I'm not going to tell you how all this works. We're gonna click through and again, we'll automatically go into the groups. You know how to behave in them.
This is the last session, so you got to get it out now. Earlier when we first started, we were looking at doing 3 groups or 5, but now it looks like there's 26, but the numbers are dwindling. People are leaving as we go to the groups. Sorry. It was 30 when I started talking. So, hey, do what we have to do in our groups. Remember, group 1 is where the interpreter will be.
Great.
And we're going to let's go for 30 minutes.
I would say maybe, so we can get some time for the large group as well, maybe about 20 minutes if you need some time to share the next steps.
Okay. 20 minutes with small group. And okay.
Yeah.
That's good.
Great.
All right. Stop acting like you don't know what to do. Let's go. Need a facilitator. Molly's going to be the note taker. I'm going to be the timekeeper. Oh, Diane. Diane, how are you? My favorite facilitator is in this meeting, in this group. You're muted too. Don't try that. Don't try to act like it's technology. Don't do it.
I'm actually sick today too, so I'm trying to reserve my voice.
Okay. Okay. All right. We'll give it a pass.
Does somebody have the questions for the chat?
They're in the chat.
They are in the chat, Beth.
Thank you, Molly.
Well, Diane's trying to save her voice.
Well,
You're not supposed to talk to MSD. Who's volunteering? It's gonna be
I can facilitate.
Who's that? Who's that?
That was Eric. This is Erica.
Okay.
I can facilitate if need be.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Not a problem. Okay. So our first question, what policies, procedures, and technical assistance can MSDE implement to reduce exclusionary practice for students with disabilities?
This is where I won't remain so quiet. I think it's working. I think it's working in conjunction with some of the other divisions within MSDE, late student services, on guidance around best practices for student code of conduct. Right. I know with Anne Arundel County and our work with disproportionality, the around discipline, the number of students that get discipline and even exclusionary discipline for things like unsafe actions or even disrespect and disrespect and things is pretty large. And so I think guidance to systems around that would be very helpful.
And I made a note, if it's possible to make so that we have to have some kind of SEL curriculum that's woven throughout the day. Because I'm in my district, a lot of our kids only know mad, sad, and glad. And we have to explain to them that there's a whole array of emotions. And what tends to get them in trouble is the ability to not be able to agree to disagree and move on. So if there's a way that we could, and I don't know if MSDE can mandate a curriculum or anything like that, but I just think we need to teach the kids how to do certain things before we expect it of them, because not all of them have been taught the same way, that we've been taught. They come from different backgrounds, so they have different experiences.
I think also making sure that every staff member has that training, because as you said, Erica, like it has to be woven in throughout the day. It has to be, that teachable moment when it comes, because a lot of kids, if you say, well, how would you handle this situation? What would you do? Many of our kids can tell you, and it seems very appropriate. They can't do things in the moment. So finding ways, again, making sure that we're using, all of I have a lot of kids who don't want to, when they get to a certain feeling space, they don't want to talk. They don't want, so it's looking for other ways for them to process through that information. But what's really helpful is when everybody knows what's available and everybody's using the same structures to support kids and they're not getting something different from different people.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Bess. I was thinking about the disciplinary codes, and disrespect is a big one that you see. And there's some states where you're not allowed to suspend in school or out of school for disrespect. So I just have a wondering if I'm thinking too big. Could MSDE look at those disciplinary codes and say no exclusionary practices for these low-level codes? I mean, is that something, and that's just a wondering, and I know that's really a really big wondering. And maybe that's me wanting to put a thumb on it, but I don't know. Is there some kind of policy or that MSDE could look at those codes and say no exclusionary measure? I mean, for all kids.
Bess, I'm just looking because I reached out to my behavior team for some feedback, and that was actually one of their suggestions for this, was to provide a tiered level of discipline that reflects actual progressive discipline. And the example they gave was like using expanded alternative disciplinary measures for minor infractions to incorporate more teaching strategies as opposed to consequence-based measures only.
Yeah, in Worcester, we've revamped our entire code of conduct through our disproportionality, through our CCIS. And we've seen an extreme drop in officer referrals for our students of color and our students with disability. So I just wonder if that could be done at a state level.
I think sorry, I was just going to say, I think another consideration too is how is disrespect defined? Because sometimes there are cultural differences or cultural norms. So I think also helping kids understand what earns that offense. What does that qualify as? Because they are not going to be able to learn how to adjust their behavior because if that's what they're seeing at home, that's what is okay, or that's what culturally happens for them. That's a really hard push for them to be like, well, I'm not supposed to do. So I feel like it's also, we have to be very cognizant of the differences among our kids and their families and how we define that for them.
Well, and I think disrespect is very subjective, right? So I see I see mostly children with disabilities, although some of them are not considered educationally handicapping, like some of the children that I see who have typical cognitive abilities but are on the autism spectrum, and they may be disciplined for disagreeing with the teacher, which you know, and I'm not talking about in a violent or, you know, there's no safety issue, but persistent, maybe interrupting class because they are correcting the teacher. And so, and I see kids, a lot of exclusionary practices. I can't tell you how many families I see that when I ask them how it's going, they say, not great. The school is calling me 2 or 3 times a week to pick up my child, usually after lunch, because I don't remember the word we used for it, but technically then they're not being suspended, right? So I see this as an enormous issue. I think, yes, training is helpful, but from my experience, a lot of it is as Nate, our facilitator, said, it is very hard to change that culture. If an individual believes that discipline is the appropriate response, or they believe that a child is, quote, trying to get one over on them, it is very hard to move them no matter how much training they've had. So I really feel like, and it's also clear that many teachers don't want to, and I understand why, to deal with this. If you have 25 other kids, you can't be dealing with the one child who's always calling out, right? So I really think we need trained, not just, you know, bodies in the school, but trained behavioral health supports that are available to teachers to help them deal with this. I know that's pie in the sky because we don't even have money for what we're doing now, and this is going to cost a lot of money. But I think if we want to do this well, that's what it's going to take. There has to be somebody there who can work with the child, and it can't be the teacher all the time.
If I could just jump in. I student taught teaching students with what were at the time were severe emotional disabilities. I know that term is no longer applied. That's what the term that was used. And in the school I was at, this was a public school in Prince George's County. They had a like an on-staff crisis person who was available to help deal with on a whole class basis or on an individual basis. And very rarely were any of the students I worked with sent home or suspended, or so having individuals on staff with that training is helpful. In my school right now, for our students who can be very physically aggressive, we have a crisis team who, when you have a code, we call and someone comes in to help with the situation. So that's it.
Did somebody else? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on a lot of you have said. I think looking at all of that, the code of conduct, the discipline policies, I think is just one piece of it. But I think the less that's defined, the better. So making our discipline policies across the state a little broader and having a little bit less reach. So to speak to whoever said, you know, the disrespect being something that you can give a child time out of school for, I think making it a little bit, you know, broader and individualized at the same time. So I think having a process, I think what Josh was just talking about with if all behavior has meaning, which is, I think is very, very valid and true. And I think there's so many different situations we could talk about, different things impacting our students and why they might be dysregulated on any given day or have an episode or have continued episodes. I think digging into the meaning behind the behavior is where we're going to get traction. It's where we're going to really do the best work with our students, and it will take qualified people in the schools available to assess that behavior and what's going on and take time, you know, help support the teachers who are trying to keep the instruction going, who can spend time with that student to really evaluate and assess the meaning behind that behavior, what's going on, what support is needed, what does that child need at that moment. It really is that simple and that hard, I think, and have 23 years experience with kids with emotional disabilities. But it takes a lot of time, training, and attention to really get to the root of it. But when you do, we see amazing things and amazing progress happen. And kids can be reintegrated quickly, even within 30 minutes of a kind of big episode. So I think it takes a lot of expertise and having them in the right place, right? So if they're available to kids when they need them, I think we can do it. It's just going to take a lot of strategic placement of folks in schools who are trained, who can support that child in that team in that moment, not just with a removal, right? Not just with a timeout room. It's much more than that, to really address what's going on with our students. And it's so varied. There's so many variables impacting them every day. So, and then I think the only other thought I had was, in order for us to get some traction as a state across LEAs and just all different areas, I think leadership pulling together across jurisdictions and really looking at the exemplars and schools and jurisdictions who have had more success with this and what are they doing and how are they doing it, and learning from that so that we can get some more buy-in and that mindset shift at the leadership level, because it really does all flow down from there. So really all of us being able to envision it would be helpful. And I think having some good exemplary programs to help us see it would be helpful. I kind of jumped to number 2.
But also one other thing, my own kids attend Anne Arundel County Public Schools, and Anne Arundel, since my kids have been enrolled in schools from kindergarten on, every year they have to, they bring home a form of disciplinary, and they have to review it and sign it. I'm encouraged to go over it with them. So every year the disciplinary expectations are explained, and every school orientation that I've ever been to in Anne Arundel County has gone over what the discipline, has gone over these disciplinary expectations. So whenever the state comes up, whatever is decided, if that could, that could be sent home to everybody.
Yeah. Okay, let's go on to number 2. I just saw Mr. Hickman put something in the chat. What steps can MSDE take to ensure that educators have the appropriate training to proactively support students' behavioral and social emotional needs?
Because he could have done it, but
I think MSDE did something awesome last year with their training series that they put out. They put out a wonderful training series. I just want to shout out to MSDE for that. And we had a lot of people attend that in Worcester that attended that. So that was amazing. So I think more of that is wonderful. That state training that you guys did, I think that was amazing. Another thing that kind of combines 1 and 2 with policies and procedures, and 2 with training and support. I think that MSDE, and we talked about this at the beginning of our blueprint meetings, is putting out recommendations for ITSS or MTSS, because all of this is going to fall in that area.
Yeah. Anyone else? I know when I came to my district, and I had been working there, I think maybe 2 years, I got notice that I needed to take an intro to special education class. And I'm wondering if there's a way that MSDE can make it so that people have to take either like an intro to trauma-informed care, intro to integrating SEL in the curriculum or throughout your day, intro to classroom management, intro to, if there's a way to make it so that either teachers coming out of college have that information, or if, they have to go back and take a class or something's done online.
That's a great recommendation.
I'm full of them, Dr. Hickman. I'm joking.
Similarly to, and if we'd be working with our state legislature where they have now mandated science of learning for as teachers are up for their licensure renewal, like thinking about, is that, is that possible? Is that a possible way, as teachers are getting their licenses renewed, is that making that a requirement?
And throw FBA and BIP training in that requirement.
There you exactly. And Debbie, I think it's more than just mental health first aid training, but I think it's that whole totality of that package.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
I think mental health first aid is a place to start. I heard what Nate said earlier. I'm not seeing this being able to fall on teachers to deal with these, to deal with this in the class consistently. I really think they're going to need trained professional support and not have it be just the teachers.
Anyone else? No? Okay, I'll go into the last question, or third question. What supports do teachers and administrators need to ensure that all students with disabilities in their schools have access to appropriate behavioral interventions? So what supports do the teachers and administrators need? I know in our district, we have a lot of support staff. We have student wholeness specialists who kind of come in. If students become dysregulated, they can come in and support the student, remove them for a short amount of time, get the student back on track and return them back to class. We also have I think it's called student wellness support teams, which is a combination of a clinician, maybe an administrator. It's whoever the school deems fit to be on their team. And we have that as a support as well. Some of our other schools get assistance from BCBAs through the CCEIS grant. And then we also have a behavior consultation team that anybody can reach out to and provide support based on the referrals. So I feel like we have a lot of support for our teachers and our administrators. But when we go in and we give suggestions of interventions, there's not always a lot of follow through. Similarly, like you mentioned with the FBA and BIP training. So people get a BIP and then they just assume it's just a piece of paper and the child's going to magically change until you explain to them, no, this is what the adults have to do. This is about changing the adult behavior, not the kids' behavior. So
I just want to throw in and jump on what Erica's saying. It's sometimes having all those people in the school is excellent. And sometimes it's how they practice. So not just having them available in an office, but having staff trained circulating throughout the building, maybe assigned to a grade level or, a group of classrooms so that we can be more proactive and catch things earlier is very helpful with kids who are experiencing trauma or just dysregulation or some emotional difficulties. Catching it early is always good. So having people kind of around the building instead of I'm going to be in an office and called to a crisis after it's already escalated can be a different way to do it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. You got to be more proactive. Prevention is always cheaper than the intervention. If we can catch it earlier, then we don't have to worry about it on the back end. Anyone else? No? Okay, our last question. What additional recommendations do you have for policies and practices that may reduce exclusionary practices, help increase student regulation and coping skills, and proactively limit concerning behavior for students with disabilities?
I'm wondering, again, kind of creating a repository of resources that are used across the different jurisdictions so that we're not constantly trying to spend our time like doing our own research. Like if we know that, if I know that Bess is doing something great using this curriculum, then, rather than exploring 10 myself, okay, then, let me take this. So kind of curating that list.
Anyone else?
I was just going to say that I think, and this may sound really simplistic, but I feel like making sure that for the students with disabilities that we have all of the things that are necessary on the IEP and that we're actually implementing them. Because that's what you find out, right, when you go to manifestation meetings, is that something wasn't implemented, or that the student, depending on their age, they don't even know about the stuff that they're supposed to be. So depending on ability and age and all those kinds of things, I feel like we leave the student out of a lot of decision making and talking about what you need and what alternatives could be, to how you manage. But I think also looking at some of the kind of teaching practices, I think with a lot of the self-regulation, especially with our little ones, they're not moving. There are all these expectations that are not really developmentally appropriate that are also coming off of COVID and everything else that compound their ability to manage themselves and then to be available for learning.
Yeah, I agree with that. One other thing that I'm not sure that people think about when students are suspended is that the time out of class, when they return, nobody goes back and teaches those skills. And so I come back, I have a gap in my learning, and the teacher just keeps moving on. Well, there's a greater chance of me acting up again because I have no idea what's going on in class. And I don't know that I don't know that the teacher thinks about it or the administrator. And then to keep suspending the kid, sometimes that becomes a reinforcer, right? I know that if I do something, you're going to send me home and I don't have to be bothered with being in school. So I think we have to get creative, and administrators have to get creative. One of the things that I suggested in my district is instead of sending the kids to out of school suspension, if they're not able to remain in the classroom and not be a disruption, if it's possible to have them sit and watch the class virtually, if that was an option. So they're still in school, they're still getting the instruction, but they're not in the classroom to become a disruption. But no go yet. So I'm hoping that that's an option because we've been virtual before. So it's not like this will be something new. Any other suggestions, thoughts from the reading?
I'm going to second Diane, her recommendations.
We got a second. You want to vote? Any discussion? Any unreadiness? No.
I think it all comes down to those resources.
Comes down to the resources.
And training for administrators and non-special education providers.
And the mindset shift.
Mm-hmm.
We speak of inclusion, but as Nate was saying earlier, there's more and more. When we push for inclusion, the more there's conversation about exclusion.
Well, welcome back. Hope everybody else had as thoughtful a conversation as room 2 did. Great. So I'd love to do 2 things. One is, again, as we usually do, go around and hear a summary from each of the 3 groups. Also, if folks have questions for the other groups, love to keep this dialogue going a bit more. I think we've got a few more minutes to be able to do that. So for group 1, which is Dr. Hickman's and Molly's groups, do we have somebody willing to share the highlights of that conversation?
Well, I know that Ms. Levy did the facilitation, but I'm not sure she knows that she's to share out too. Let's see.
I didn't take a lot of notes, Dr. Hickman. Okay, go ahead.
I was gonna say this is Winifred. I can help. I took some notes. So please others chime in if I didn't capture everything that we discussed. Wait a minute. Erica, you start because I just realized this is question 1. That's not how my notes set up.
So the policies, procedures, technical assistance. I I know I mentioned adopting an SEL curriculum if possible, or somehow getting teachers to weave social emotional learning throughout their day, because a lot of times we expect kids to do things that they don't know how to do, so we have to teach them those things. Did you take any more notes? You're muted, Miss Winifred. Miss
I
Winston.
had on here about the cultural differences and the norms
Mm-hmm.
and the trauma-informed care requirements.
Yes, we also talked about how some behaviors are appropriate in some cultures, but students are getting, they get consequented for those behaviors. And we talked about maybe teachers getting some trauma-informed care training so that they understand how trauma impacts the students and the students' behaviors as well.
And would that be what we also talked about a tier, a level of discipline, and really going into define what each tier is? Like we talked a lot about what is disrespect. And we talked a lot about that, and maybe implementing a tier, a level of tiers for discipline.
Yes, and making the definitions a little more specific, because we have insubordination. What does that mean? You know, she talked about disrespect. What does that mean? What it means to one person might not mean the same to the student. So should I go through all of our questions, or are you going to go to the other group for questions?
No, why don't you share highlights? You don't necessarily need to go question by question, really highlights of the key points that
okay,
your conversation.
Okay. We also discussed teachers, and we just said that this would be a lot for teachers to take on. So having additional support staff in the buildings. So if you have another mental health professional who can support, or having an preferred adult for students to go to before they become dysregulated and require an out of school suspension. One of the things that I remember that I had mentioned was, is it possible, instead of out of school suspension, doing it in school in a different classroom for the student, but they can get virtual learning, if that was an option? Ms. Winston, do you have other notes?
About for 2 or 3 of the questions, we all talked about an additional support staff, someone who's trained and understands and getting to the root cause of the behavior. We talked about a mental health first aid person. We gave examples in other districts where they had a person or a department where if a child was upset, they could go to that space, calm them down, and then bring them back. So we talked a lot about having additional staff members trained. And we also talked about MSDE implementing certain training criteria. So when you recertify, you have to be trained in XYZ. I can't remember what that was, you guys, but we talked about that as well, to give the staff continuing training, making sure that teachers that come out of school, that they have it, and then those who recertify, they have that training. And we talked about a resource list so that teachers don't have to scramble and try to find things. It is approved by MSDE. Here it is. Here's a list of resources to help.
Great, thanks. I really appreciate that. One of the things that I really just wanted to highlight as I was listening to you all share out that hadn't quite connected in my head before, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this, what was the need for both these practices and supports that you talked about, but also the need to make sure there are enough adults to help with them. Because I think that, at least for me, just reflecting, because everything you're saying makes a ton of sense to do. And then I'm thinking, but teachers feel so stressed, because I think in some ways we have gone to them and said, hey, everything you were just thinking about, the same number of people who are already very full plates, you should all be doing this as well on top of what you're already doing. So I just really appreciated this idea that there's a human capacity, the number of folks who are going to need to implement some of these, maybe larger than the number of folks we currently have in our schools as we add some of these new expectations. So really appreciated that insight. Let's, Buzzy, I see your hands up.
Thank you. Let me go global for a minute. Everything I've heard, we know the problems. We know the road to the solutions, but we don't have the money. Virtually everything that's been suggested has a price tag. Now, that means, in my view, two things. One, someday we'll get an adequacy study. The other thing is that I hope when we move to a plan for a plan, that effort can try to set priorities. How would you prioritize the different kinds of interventions? So I think the more concrete we can be, we're in some sense a mile wide and an inch deep.
Great, thanks for sharing that, Buzzy. Group 2, which is Gary's group, my group, we have a volunteer to share the highlights of our conversation. Renee, can I ask you to share?
Yeah, the person that didn't take a single note. Sure.
Yeah, but your memory is pretty darn good.
Yeah, Nate. Flattery will get you everywhere. So the guys, please chime in if I've missed anything. But there was a real theme amongst all of the questions around really making sure we really talked a lot about restorative practices. What does that look like? What does that really mean? What does, how do we support our teachers? How do we make sure we have consistency in elementary, middle, and high school? How do we also make sure that there's all of the support to make sure that it can happen about, building relationships, the empathy, all of those pieces to recognize it, and also availing ourselves to already good things that are going on in the state. I had shared that that Maryland is the recipient of the State Personnel Development Grant, and we have 2 LEAs that are getting really great evidence-based training and support and coaching using implementation science around restorative practices and academics. And so there were lots of conversations about the interconnectivity of all of those things. And we really also talked about making sure that when there's an administrative change at a school, that culture and that consistency of those restorative practices stay in place. But also we talked about training and really making sure that families and schools are all really consistent and supported in that. Anything else?
I think, at least from my notes, I think you did a great job. Flattery deserved. Anybody else from the group want to add to that? Add to Renee's summary?
I just want to add one thing, which is that we talked a little bit about, or quite a bit actually, about relationships as like such a foundational piece, and did sort of tie it back to the current discussion around collaborative time and the importance of the adults in the building having time to build relationship with one another, to be a community of adult learners as the sort of foundational piece to, and those relationships enabling more retention, and then relationships with students, and that underlying that being, discipline, behavior, attendance, and academic achievement, right? That relationship is right at the core of that. And if we don't give our educators enough time to be together and to build, to train together, to do professional learning together, and to collaborate on an ongoing basis, we're not gonna have that foundation for our schools.
I'd love to just follow that. Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Renee. I just want to follow up because I know we talked a lot about relationships in our group, and I'm looking at the chat. I'm getting a lot of confirmations of that. I am curious if anybody, it doesn't have to be group 2, just any insights or thoughts as to if relationships are really important, and I take for granted that most teachers really, really like kids and want to do the right thing and are teachers for the right reasons. How do we get to a place where the relationships aren't as strong as they need to be? I'm just curious, what do people see as root causes, if any insight? Because on one hand, I totally agree with that recommendation. On the other hand, it's somewhat puzzling that we got to tell teachers to get a relationship with their students. Dee, I don't know if your hand is up to answer that question or you had something else to share. I see your hand up as well.
I put it up to add to something else that we discussed in the group, but it wasn't the relationship piece. So I can wait until you finish this question.
Come back to you in a
the
sec.
groups, Nate, first, and then see what comes up.
We'll definitely get to group 3 in 1 second. We're just curious because we're seeing a lot of thoughts on the relationships, and I don't know if somebody had anything they could add to. And Eric, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so I think one of the big things that I've been seeing in my district is that the adults don't know how to let things go and start fresh every day. So if a student does something on Monday, the teachers will hold on to it, or administrator will hold on to it until the end of the school year. And so that kid essentially will have a target on them. And I think understanding that nothing that the students do is personal. I think that's the hardest part for a lot of the adults. It's never personal. You know that you didn't do anything to the student. They're not trying to give you a hard time. They're just having a hard time. And reminding our teachers every day, it has to be fresh, a fresh start.
No, thanks. I see a few new hands, Debbie and then Agatha.
So I agree, and I think we talked a little bit in our group also about the need for a cultural shift and maybe viewing some of child behavior a little bit differently. But I think part of that is also having to deal with these behaviors on a daily basis without the needed supports, because I think teachers do get tired of it, right? So I think if they had someone who could step in and help if there were some challenging behaviors, it might be easier for them to let things go as well. So I think there are two things at play.
Great, appreciate that. And Agatha.
I agree with everything that was just said about relationships. It's not about having a relationship. I think you're right. Most teachers understand that's part of their job. It's about how we use our relationships, and it's about what Eric was saying with restorative practices and really not taking it personal. And that is hard to do, and it's especially hard to do if you don't have the resources and support, and you have a lot of students in front of you with a lot of needs. But I do think it's all about the mindset shift and what is our role with that relationship. If we can work with a student, stick with a student who is really struggling, and show them that we're sticking with them, even through the really tough days and moments, that's where you start to make progress. As you're building trust. It's a trusting relationship. It's not just having a relationship. It's a person they can depend on to help them.
Great, thanks. So let's go to group 3, and if we got time, I'll circle back to you, Dee. Group 3.
Yeah, that's me.
Yep.
Our group basically came down to 2 points. We felt like, first of all, that the tools were already out there, and there weren't any new tools that folks didn't know about. And we figured that it boiled down to both will and resources. So the implementation of these practices, I guess, related to the relationships that you've talked about, is important, and teachers need to be invested in them. And then, many of these practices require additional resources. So we can come up with a lot of ideas, but without resources, it's not really possible to implement them. For example, we talked about things like a functional behavior assessment, which requires the taking of data and things of that nature, which are very involved. And then the follow-up on that is also very involved. And a teacher can only do so many things in a classroom. Another area we talked about is separating this discussion between those students who had serious psychological, emotional disturbances and other students with disabilities. In some cases, it seemed in the reading that every behavior was manageable by some sort of means, but in fact, it's very complicated, especially when it gets to folks who take medication or have very serious self-injurious behaviors and things like that. So I think it's important to separate out we felt that it was important to separate out the differences. But nevertheless, MSDE, maybe their role would be to take more follow-up data, but the fact is that the tools already exist.
Great. I really appreciate that, David. And I know I know, Dr. Hickman, you want to share some next steps. Just want to say two things. One, that super insightful conversations today always have been, but I thought today in particular really shed a lot of insight on this. And I just really want to kind of double click, David, on something that you said. As I work cross country, this idea that there is not going to be one plan, that, the different, not just the tiers, but some kids having some very unique or very significant needs. And I do think that we've seen too often school systems have tried to pick a plan and then apply it to a really wide range of kids, some of which was a really appropriate application and some might be a real misapplication. And I think if you're a teacher and you're experiencing this misapplication, kind of makes you kind of frustrated with the whole approach. So I really thought that was a very valuable insight. So thanks for sharing that.
Can I just chime in with one last really quickly, just to piggyback on that point? I absolutely agree with what David said and your follow-up, Nate. And I think, but I think maybe one piece is to not think about the tier one piece being an old mindset, right? Because I think that what we think is, well, we need this special newfangled, very intensive behavior support for kids that have these very extreme behaviors that are very challenging and might be rooted in, an emotional disturbance and a real, psychological, something that's being treated with medication or intensive therapy or whatever. But for everybody else, they can deal with just 3 strikes you're out and, whatever. And that actually, we end up putting more kids on the pathway to being traumatized at school because we are responding to behaviors in a way that, rather than being rooted in relationship, it becomes rooted in compliance. And so I think there is, yes, there need to be multiple levels of response, but what that first universal kind of level of response needs to be, I don't see out in the world application of the tools that we know already exist. And that, and it sounds to me like there's a lot of good work happening at MSDE now. It was great to hear from Brad about a little bit of that work. All right.
Morning. Thanks so much. Great conversation. Dr. Hickman, going to turn it over to you to bring us home.
All right. Well, thank you. I think I want to finish the same way we started this conversation today. One was with appreciation. As the newest member of the leadership team, I'll say, I want to just give appreciation to those who fought to even get this work group together. I wasn't here when it started, but I've definitely been here for the past 16. I think when I say that, I'm appreciative to Liz Zogby and also Mr. Hedelman, Buzzy Hedelman, for the work that was done before I even got here and the ongoing work. I think Leslie Margolis and the conversations that we've had and that work to even get to this point is a huge undertaking, and it is something that's definitely commendable. I'm going to use Mr. Hedelman's words from earlier tonight, and he said it quite often, that we're doing something no one else is really doing, no other state is doing anything like this, and this is a tremendous effort. It's a tremendous work to have the resources, to even get this done. The next part of it is the implementation. I also want to thank the MSDE team, those that have been working behind the scenes month after month. Just on, and we're just speaking of the special ed work group for right now, month after month to get the pre-readings done, to get the exit tickets compiled, to get the emails, and there's meetings that have occurred weekly, sometimes twice a week, and collaboratively with MSDE, specifically DEI and SES. Um, but there's other departments. There's early childhood. There's also student support, the accountability, the assessment office, and those departments, the Office of Teaching and Learning. It's been a collective effort to get to this point. It's not over, but it is the last official meeting that we need to recognize, because some people we may not get a chance to see again. With that being said, I'm also Mr. Levinson. Thank you, Nate Levinson, for your work in helping to facilitate us throughout this process from from when I began to now, to help us to get to facilitating the meetings, to organization, to working on the prioritizations in the middle, and at the end, and for agreeing to stay in the game with us until we get it across to the finish line. And anyone else, that's the bad thing about when you start naming names, you forget somebody. So now I want to thank everybody and everybody, and that means you. So if I didn't say your name, I'm talking to you. Thank you for your support. So now, next slide, please. So as this conversation has gone on, what we've realized over the past few months is, and it's been said over and over again, it's not entirely new work. It's a lot of things that are being new work or new ideas. As we celebrate the 50th anniversary of IDA and the 20th anniversary of the reauthorization, um, some of the questions, concerns, and things that we're fighting for have been recurring. We've made some improvements in some areas, and then we'll see that, and sometimes those things fall off. But in terms of the recommendations that you've made, I shared with you, you'll see the next 3 slides. Click to the third slide real quick, because I don't have it in front of me. I just need to get my number right. One more. Yeah. So tonight we'll be up to 25. Now you can go back to the to the first one. Tonight, we're up to 25 recommendations. With those 25 recommendations, there are sub bullets under the sub bullets, or other tasks that are assigned with them, which comprises about 130 some actions that have come out, right? There is absolutely and positively no way we're going to get those things done immediately, but we do have to prioritize what things we need to do. But there's some things that you need to know that have been going on. It's not like we're going to start after we submit the additional report, the addendum to the final report that we sent in December. For example, a few things. Just want to share. MSD has drafted a standard for IEP development to close and narrow the gap. We've also currently have a draft of tab 1901, which helps to integrate that standard. We have inclusion. Completed the inclusion guide with your help and stakeholder review that was distributed. In terms of monitoring, we were able to repurpose 2 positions, one to create an additional monitoring specialist, and to also an additional complaints investigator. Either we're in the place right now, one has been offered and one has been hired. We've also initiated conversations with the Office of Teaching and Learning as we beef up our monitoring process to be inclusive, or to include specialists to help us with the monitoring process. We're currently reviewing applications, and this is a plug for Dr. Morrison. We're currently reviewing applications to fill the vacant section chief for monitoring and accountability. So if you know of anyone that is skilled that you recommend, please let them know we have a vacancy in that area. We met with the Maryland Online IEP team. We disseminated surveys to obtain some stakeholder feedback on the Maryland Online IEP system. We've conducted meetings with the 4 non-MOIEP users to identify their perceived barriers and why they, to switch, why they didn't switch, or why they've gone. We're working with Johns Hopkins right now to examine the feasibility and cost of implementing those barriers or removing those barriers. We've also revised our comprehensive monitoring questions to include information about the dissemination of MOIP information. We've updated our reporting system. And MSDE obtained information about other states. So we've met and explored some things with other states. And there's consideration that's being strongly given to doing a state audit on an RFP, pretty much to look at our system and to see if there's something else out there that is better. You go to the next slide, please. And also in terms of staffing and service delivery, we reviewed our previous staffing plan guidance. We're currently investigating whether other states have staffing plan guidance, and with that, we'll make changes as needed. We've created language and developed language for our senior leadership and our board to consider the feasibility of contracting for a third-party independent contractor to conduct a special education fiscal adequacy study. We are also, in terms of significant disproportionality, one of the recommendations was to contract. We started that contract several months ago with hired a consultant, New K-12 Solutions, to help us to review our root cause analysis, updating our process. We currently have that contract. We conducted an audit of our tools for the root cause analysis and the CCIS plans that resulted from the analysis. The review and analysis are complete, and they're working with MSDE and our locals to develop their plans and get them finalized and to help move the work along. Next slide, please. In terms of early childhood, as I mentioned, we've worked closely with our with the Department of Early Childhood to try to increase the outcomes for our small kids, our young ones, looking at our child care and trying to make sure that we have high quality child care. We had an opportunity this year, if you'll remember, to work with our colleagues, our partners over at Parents Place of Maryland to create a family school partnership survey. We had a focus group, and then from that, we pivoted and even met with our LEAs and shared some of the results with how to improve on those things. I just share those things briefly with you because the work is overlapping. We haven't stopped and we're going to continue. We're brought into this process. This will not be a plan on the shelf. It is actually something that we're working on that's helping to build the strategic plan as we move the work forward. Next slide. And so in order, how are we going to keep up with all this? Well, thanks to our special education work group, our executive committee, and our MSDE team, we've developed a tracker using the Smart Sheets project management software tool. And it looks at the recommendations, when they were made, what was the completion date, where did we start? We have a way of tracking progress, whether it's ongoing, completed, or on track. And even if we are behind, there's documentation. It's a place for us to be accountable and to hold others accountable. We are in DEI, the Division of Early Intervention and Special Education Services. We are the champions of this work, but a lot of this work overlaps other departments in the agency. But we're working collaboratively with them to get those things done. You'll receive kind of an update on that quarterly. Move to the next slide, please. You should have been able to, somebody put a note, should they be able to see slides? I hope so, because I've been going through the last 4 slides.
I'm like, is it me? Did I change my view? I was like, all I see is us.
At the top of your screen, Winifred, you should have some tabs, and one of them probably says something like OIT MSDE screen. Do you see that? As opposed, and you can toggle from the meeting, which is just the people. Okay.
See, when true leaders will own up to it, it's probably my fault. Anyway, just a brief rundown on what to expect. So again, we are taking those recommendations. We're taking the additional recommendations. So the next steps, one, we're going to share your January feedback with the work group. You will also have an opportunity um, to that's when to identify and finalize the final recommendations. We'll be doing that electronically this time, sort of like your exit ticket process. We'll put the recommendations, send it to you, hopefully by February 4th, and give you time to review it and send that back. We'll draft the prioritization of all recommendations. The goal is by February 21st that we take the first round, similar to what we did before when we met. We put our priorities together, and then we came before you. So we'll share that with the executive committee the week of February 24th. Then the first week in March. I know this is aggressive, but we need to get this done. The first week in March is when we plan to convene our small group sessions so that we can work on with you and get your feedback on the plan. By March 14th, we want to have that plan finalized. Um, and then we need to share a draft addendum to the final report to the executive committee by March 31st. And then, as you see moving forward, the addendum to the work group, hold a meeting with the work group to finalize it. So in April, we're looking at April 23rd as convening a meeting with the work group so that you can get an understanding and see where we are with the report. I'm going to just remind those who don't already know that this is the last official meeting, and those other opportunities are strictly voluntary for you to participate. And it's not just to get updates, but also to get feedback from you. And then we'll wrap that addendum to the final report to Dr. Wright and MSDE leadership. And you submit the addendum to the final report to AIB by May 30th. Next slide. And so the upcoming meetings will be the 5 work group sessions. 5 small work group sessions for your feedback the week of March 2025. Finalizing the report, April 23rd is a meeting. And then the quarterly update meetings will be July, October, January, and April 2026. Of course, this presentation and all the information I share will be on the website. Next slide. This slide isn't here just to say that we've made a commitment to you. MSDE is committed, Dr. Wright, the executive committee, and others that we really want not to break the trust, but we want to keep our commitment to getting the work done and making sure that we provide positive outcomes for our students with disabilities across the state of Maryland. And with that, we have 5 minutes. Ms. Zogby, do you want to take us all the way home?
I'm happy to, and I do want to say, I named names in the beginning, and I did not acknowledge Nate, and I do want to acknowledge Nate, who I really do credit with helping us in the transition from our first couple of meetings to figuring out how to make everyone's voice able to be heard and really, utilize the perspectives and harness the perspectives and expertise of this group. And I think it really it was really important for him to step in at the moment that he did to help us kind of get on track. And I do really credit him with helping us find a rhythm and a flow and a process that was really, I think, very successful. And I do just want to say, I appreciate, I've learned so much from all of you and from this process. I feel like it's remarkable to think back over this last year and a half and all the things that we've learned and all the ways we've grown together. So, yeah, just thank you again. And this is turning the page on one chapter, but so much to come. And I hope that we will continue to be in touch. And that's it. That's all I've got to say.
All right. With that said, you shall have the exit ticket will be in your box in the morning on this particular meeting. And that's all, folks. You are free to go.